Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everybody. And thanks so much for coming this afternoon. Our topic today is the route to market to the US market for distilled spirits brands. As a lot of you guys know, the US market is sometimes perceived as being very attractive. For a lot of people, it's been perceived as being very complicated, and probably the truth is both. And we have today a distinguished panel of people that have done their way in different ways, and everybody has a different angle to the issue of like how best to do it and what type of avenues to maybe do and which avenues to possibly avoid. So I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves first, and then we're going to go through a couple of charts just to provide the context, and then we're going to go through a couple of issues that are very relevant for this topic. So Nick, why don't you get started, introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Thank you, Harry. So my name is Nick Papanikolaou. I joined Pernod Ricard a few years ago in the US to run the M&A team. And one of the internal strategy projects we worked on there was developing an incubation unit and a little bit of a hybrid between an incubation unit and a venture capital vehicle to partner with external entrepreneurial-led brands. So I joined that group. We launched it officially last summer in 2016. And my role there has been focused on sourcing new brands to bring into that group and to partner with and help them unlock their value. I also just want to quickly mention, before I joined Pernod, I had actually launched my own brand and worked with Harry at Park Street. So hopefully if there's some value add I can provide here, it's seeing things from both the perspective of an entrepreneur and in a larger corporate organization.
Cool, thanks, Nick. My name's Dan Gasper. I'm one of the co-founders of a London-based business called Distilled Ventures. We are the world's only spirits accelerator, so we give entrepreneurs access to capital, mentoring, and expertise to help them go further faster with their businesses. We launched Distilled Ventures back in 2013 now. We're just over 4 years old. In that time, we have invested in 16 different early stage and growing drinks companies in Europe, but also in North America, where we have several investments. And we've committed around £80 million to those businesses. I guess I'm here because we've seen a lot of entrepreneurs either from Europe go to North America and have a bit of a shocker, or in America trying to grow and beat the system. So I think you'll get some really interesting inputs today. Thanks, Harry.
Perfect, thanks.
Hi, I'm Brandon Lieb. I am the co-founder of Atlantico Rum. It's a rum that we started about 8 years ago. We are in about 15 to 20 countries now. US is obviously our largest market. Prior to Atlantico, I was at Bacardi, managed their rums for a short period of time, as well as Di Serono, and then also managed their tequila portfolio and Grey Goose vodka for the US market. So very much have pretty extensive background managing spirits in the US and dipping my toe in the water a little bit here in Europe.
Hi, my name is Neil Everett. I'm the founder and CEO of Brockman's Gin. I'm a 25-year industry veteran. That's what's given me the grey hairs. Originally, Allied Domecq, I was the president of Europe when the company was sold. I then spent 4 years working with private equity with Oak Tree Capital. We built Stock Spirits, and since 2007 I've been incubating my own baby, which is Brockman's Gin. And the reason I'm here is we are in the US with Brockman's. It's our third market after the UK and Spain. We're focused exclusively in the northeast of the country for the moment. And in the spirit of openness, our importer of record is Park Street, Harry's company. And they do a great job, by the way. So there's the plug, Harry.
Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm Guillermo Erickson Sousa. We make Fortaleza tequila. We're in the town of Tequila, Jalisco. And we're approximately 90% of our sales are in the United States. We're in 33 states there with different distributors. And in 16 countries in total. We're an independent distillery and we own our own brand. And they invited me here because they wanted it to tequila, see?
All right, thanks guys. So I'm going to quickly walk you guys through a little bit of the context. So if you guys can switch over to the presentation for a second. Perfect, so that one is easy, so let's go to the next one. And the next one. Perfect, so if you look at the US market, and for those of you who like movies, I like movies a lot. You guys might know this movie, but it's a very famous movie in the US. It's called Field of Dreams. And it's, it's a scene where somebody's asked to like build it and they come. And for a lot of entrepreneurs, it's always this thing where you feel like, hey, you build your brand and then you're done. Well, the real story is, hey, you build what consumers really want, but in the United States, you gotta go in and you gotta say, it's like, hey, we are unfortunately not legally allowed to buy from you, and what you gotta do is you gotta first find a distributor or an ABC board, and we're gonna explain what that is, that believes that this product will sell. And then if they find a retailer that also believes that we want to buy it, then you might have a business. So it's not as easy as build it and they come, and we're going to try to put some light into of like what it would mean to basically get it done. Could we go to the next one, please? So if you look at the US market, and given the political situation in the US, well, for those of you who are not in the US, you might see it from the outside. There's obviously a little bit of trouble. This society is very divided. It's very difficult to get agreement on anything. And alcoholic beverages is the only industry that required two constitutional amendments to get regulated. So when you look at it, and you feel like alcoholic beverages is around like 1% of GDP, but it required 2/3 of all constitutional amendments. The only other one that you would think that actually, somehow is related to an industry is the Second Amendment, which regulates the ability to carry guns, which a lot of people are worried about too. Anyway, why is that? Because a lot of people at the time were worried about alcoholic beverages, and let's quickly talk about this. Can we go to the next chart, please? So when you look into like what happened, why there were constitutional amendments, there was a big movement at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, to somehow get rid of this evil, supposedly evil, that was obsessing the men that were working and were coming home, and the wives that were sitting at home and hoping that the husbands and fathers would bring the money home, that they would not stop at a saloon and waste all the money and then come home drunk. And so they built this anti-saloon league, and that became a movement over like a 50-year period, which then led to the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which then became effective 1920. And then obviously, as all of you guys know, if you like movies again, a lot of the crime movies, like organized crime, etc., was all developed during Prohibition because it was a victimless crime. And the people realized that Prohibition might not be the right thing. And funny enough, now in the US, well, there's another drug or another substance that people felt very bad about, like marijuana. It goes now through the process of thinking like maybe this is a victimless crime also, and maybe we should actually liberate it instead of trying to put everybody in jail that is affiliated with this. Because again, during the time of the 18th Amendment, people went to jail for drinking. So can we go to the next chart, please? So what is the legal ramification today? So we basically have a very complex legal framework. So every state is regulated differently, and there is a regulation on the federal side. So when they tried to get rid of Prohibition, they had to go and appeal to a political process. So what they said is, hey, we're not going to get all 50 states to approve it if we say we're going to give them the regulation. We just said, we'll let everybody else regulate it themselves. So if you want to keep Prohibition in place, you can. So some states actually kept it in place for like decades afterwards. But states like New York, etc., they want to get rid of Prohibition right away. So this is a system now which has a federal framework that just says like, oh, you got to get registered, you got to get licensed, but ultimately you have to get registered and licensed in a particular state too, and in that state, the laws of that state are relevant. So if you operate in the United States, you operate technically in a loose association of 50 different countries. And one of the key items is the three-tier system and the tight house rules. For those of you who don't know what that means, it's basically the anti-saloon league thought that the German brewers were really the ones to blame leading up to Prohibition, because they felt that they put all the saloon owners in business. They basically put all the money up for them to build the saloons, and they didn't really have to have too much there, but they were tied to a particular producer. So when they got rid of Prohibition, they said it's like one rule there is, they said there's going to be three tiers: the suppliers, the wholesalers, and the retailers. And if you're a player in one tier, you should not play in another tier also. It's not completely strict everywhere, because the government is in the business in some states where they actually do the retail and the wholesale business, so they're in more than one tier. But ultimately, that's a rule that technically applies in every state. And then the overall framework is driven by two things. One is you want to promote temperance, which means don't drink enough. But on the other hand, we want to collect money, we want to get taxes. We want actually you guys to drink a lot because we want to make a lot of taxes. So it's a little bit of a balancing act in both ways. But that's the regulatory framework. In some instances, it's being regulated down from the state to local municipalities. And in some states, you actually have complete different legal frameworks if you just walk from one village to another. So can we go to the next chart, please? So when you look at the industry structure, and this is where we're going to start our panel, the industry structure here is one where you have the suppliers, the wholesalers, and the retailers. Overall, it's wine and spirits here together on it. Why are they together? Because they go technically through the same system. So wine and spirits travel on the same trucks, typically being sold by similar salespeople, and the regulation is very similar. So beer is somehow separate. The beer industry lobbied very hard to position themselves more as a soft drink with alcohol, and therefore got like much more easier regulations in a way than wine and spirits. So overall on this chart, you see basically how big the different tiers are. So the spirits industry is on retail $81 billion in 2015. And you see how that relates to the wholesalers and the suppliers. And you look at the concentration side on the right. So you see that the suppliers, basically the top 10 suppliers, make around like 3/4 of the business. And on the wholesale side, it's a little less concentrated, it's 70%. But that's 2015, so after the merger of Glazers and Southern, it's actually probably in the same order of magnitude. And then the retail side is less concentrated, with the top 10 less than 15%. Well, these are the numbers when you look at it as an analyst looking at the United States. The real numbers here are different, because when you go into a particular state, a wholesaler doesn't operate in every state. And looking at it nationally, it's not the right view. You got to look at it on a state-by-state basis. In some states, you have two wholesalers doing probably 95% of the business. So it's highly concentrated. Well, on the retail side, you have some states like New York State, where you have a liquor law that doesn't allow somebody to own more than one liquor license. You have high fragmentation. There's basically like the top 10 retailers don't do more than 1 or 2%. While in California, where you don't have that law, it's much more concentrated. So it's very fragmented in some states and very concentrated in some other states. So talking about industry structures, I'm going to hand it over to you, Nick. Are you worried at all about the industry being concentrated and becoming more concentrated, or what's your view?
Sure. Thanks, Harry. Look, I think the future inherently by definition is uncertain. So there's always some element of worry in how smaller brands and even larger brands can get affected by this consolidation. But in general, I think I'm very optimistic. And the reason I'm optimistic, well, there's a few reasons actually, but one of them, I think, given what Harry just discussed and suppliers starting to consolidate and that creating a chain reaction with distributors starting to consolidate and then retailers, I think whenever there's a massive push in one direction, there almost by definition has to be a counter reaction to that. So I think we're absolutely, and we've started to see it a little bit, a pushback to kind of disrupt in some ways the existing distribution landscape. So in general, I'm optimistic. I think that trend will continue. I also think if you look at the barriers to entry, and this is somewhat related to the first answer I gave, the barriers to entry are increasingly lower in the US. So if you look at ease of fundraising, I mean, now you've got angel list networks, and you've got crowdfunding, and you've got VCs looking at the space, which they didn't traditionally look at. So you've got greater access to funding. You've got easing regulation for craft producers and small producers. You've got kind of a democratization of of social media and digitalization of advertising. So I think all of these factors, and then some, those are just a few, have led to a decreasing barriers to entry. And I think this is a good thing. I think it allows, I'm sure there's many entrepreneurs in the audience today, I think it's going to allow opportunities for you to access the market more easily. And then working with groups like Park Street, and Park Street's fantastic, but there are many others as well, just to be clear, working with groups like that potentially can be a different or non-traditional means to access the U.S. market. So I'm not worried, I'm very optimistic, and I think there's a lot of good signs that you see some of that disruption slowly starting to happen.
Interesting. So, Dan, do you have any other view on it?
Optimistic, I think. What I didn't know 4 years ago was how much of the work we were going to have to do. It's not easy to get listed in some wholesalers. They simply won't take you. As a new brand and a one-company brand, to get attention from them is really difficult because they are going to do what they need to do for the people who are paying their bills. And they are Diageo, Bacardi, Pernod, etc. So I agree with you in terms of you can get the access, but access to what? If you end up having to do all the work, which is my experience, then that's fine. But I don't think anybody should be under any illusions of the cost of market entry in the US. Because if you have to open every distribution point, do every activation activity, and even offering good money to wholesaler reps, they don't actually turn up because they're not being told to execute on you. That's fine, but you're doing it all yourself.
Yeah, you're almost paying a wholesaler sometimes. We hear this from some clients where it's like you got to make sure you're in the incentive game to make sure that, you know, while you made the sale, they might not switch it out for another brand in a similar category. Do you see some of these?
Yeah, I mean, the goal, and it's now happening to us 3 and 4 years in with in a couple of states, you've got to get on that sell sheet. And that's, you know, the area managers managing their sales reps to specific MBO type objectives. Oh, and by the way, they should also know that every time they touch a bottle of Brockman's, they're going to get an incentive, whether it's a placement or a menu or whatever. But it's taken us a lot of time and a lot of money to get to that position. As far as I'm aware, we've never been switched out, although there were some rumors early on that a competitor brand who was also with the same wholesaler was doing that for us. So they were targeting our accounts to switch the sell, but it wasn't the wholesaler, it was them.
Yeah.
So that phenomenal access, but I think you need to be understanding and ready to do the work yourself.
When you guys look at the retail consolidation, especially for those of you guys who know the European market a little bit, if you compare it, I mean, here everybody is afraid of the retail power. Is there like a risk in the US that you see this going the same way?
So I think, I mean, going back to your point you made earlier, Harry, you know, looking at the US as 50 different countries is really important. When you look at Europe, you can choose a distributor who might say that they can distribute across Europe, but it's not really true. And I think you've just got to look at each state individually and go really, really slowly. The businesses that we work with that have had success in North America have found a partner who likes what they do, who has they have a good relationship with to start with. They see eye to eye, and then they're able to build a relationship with that one distributor in one state and go one state at a time. I think there's a lot of people who think they can go to America and everything will be ready for them, but we advise all of the businesses we're invested in and in the talks that we do that taking it really slowly and finding a partner who actually appreciates what you're doing is the most important thing. And I think with this consolidation, I think you'll find that that partner might not be one of the larger distributors that is a great partner for you to start with. There are lots of, unfortunately called second tier or third tier distributors who might actually suit a small business a lot better. But I'd love to hear what Guillermo has to say on that particular comment, because you have some big distributors and some small distributors.
Well, for us, we're in 33 states with different distributors in all the states for a reason, so that we don't get choked out by a distributor, by one distributor. So if you're putting a brand, you know, there's something to being on the safe side of having different distributors. The consolidation that we see is somewhat upsetting to us, because the larger the distributors get, the less attention they seem to spend on small brands who intend on staying small. If you're a small brand and you intend on going big, you intend on being acquired out, it's not a problem, because you're going to be acquired out by somebody big, and it doesn't really matter that somebody big's going to get you the attention. But if you're intending to stay small, having only 2 distributors in California which is what really we got in California, two giant distributors, and then everybody else is rather small. Well, the one we have, Wine Warehouse, is about 250 sales reps. But if you're developing a brand, the formula is just look at how many sales reps they have and multiply that by about 80 accounts, and that's how many places they can visit. So when you consolidate all these guys up, and what just happened with Southern Wine and Spirits, now they have a Bacardi team, a Diageo team, a Pernod Ricard team, and so all their salesmen are divided into teams. And where does a small brand go so that you can get a full coverage? So you're stuck with a somewhat limited coverage because your distributor can only cover so many accounts. So that's just concerns from our side that we see.
Yeah. From a perspective of, and I don't know, can we go to the next chart for a second? From a perspective of the launch markets, so how you pick a particular market, when you look through going with a high-end image market or a second-tier market, going with a franchise or non-franchise market, or open states versus control states, is there like a rule of thumb or something where you would think like, hey, somebody should think more this way or that way? Is there like a...
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts on this are most people who are entering the U.S. market, even if it's a U.S.-based brand, look at launch markets and they all name the same 6 or 7 markets that they want to enter. They want to be in Miami, New York, Chicago, Dallas, L.A., and San Francisco, right? And the challenge there is that's where everybody wants to be. It becomes more expensive. You're spread out. And so, yes, they may be the largest markets or the most glamorous markets, but at the end of the day, you have the most competition. So you can find great markets that maybe are secondary markets that you can build some traction in and go about it that way and kind of do more of a grassroots approach. In San Francisco, as an example, is it's a huge cocktail culture. It's it's a place people want to be. It's a place where some of the best restaurants and bars in the country are. But I don't know a single brand really that is doing a significant amount of volume in San Francisco. It's more the prestige of being there. I do a lot more volume in Atlanta, Georgia than I do in San Francisco, and I've spent a hell of a lot more money and a lot more attention and time in San Francisco than I have in Atlanta. So it depends on what your goals are and what you're looking for, but I do think it's important to kind of take a step back and say, hey, where are the real business opportunities as opposed to these are the largest markets.
Got it. Any view on franchise versus non-franchise markets? So franchise markets, just as a background, is basically one where you get in and you're in, meaning you get divorced without a prenup and without any opportunity to ever remove yourself from it. So it's kind of like you get married and you're done. So any view on, if you want to go there first or later, or how you think about it?
Quickly, just my point of view is I certainly prefer to launch in open markets first. Not that I think it's necessarily that they're better markets. It's that when you enter a franchise market, you are making a serious commitment, right? You're not changing. You're with that distributor. You're with them for good. So for me, starting in open markets, not only does it help me get the brand up and running, but it also gives me time to evaluate and figure out who are the better distributor partners to have in those franchise markets, because, like I said, when you make that commitment, you're all in. So,
Neil?
Yeah, I mean, we deliberately chose not to go to the big market first in our first year. We went to Massachusetts and New Jersey. And we chose two very different wholesalers. One in Mass being a franchise market, but it's, I can't remember the technical term, you can practice polygamy. So you can appoint other distributors, you just can't fire any
You
of
can
them.
marry several times.
Exactly. So more progressive in that way. And part of what informed us was that they were significant markets in terms of the gin habit, but also we didn't have to deal with the Southern question. And initially, in terms of long-term risk, I didn't want to have to sign a contract that would marry me to 30% of the upside going back across the table as and when in some future point we may be acquired. So as it happens, we went for a wine distributor in Massachusetts, Ruby, who did a great job, but we found some limitations there, and we're now dualed with Horizon. And that combination is working very well, and in Jersey we're with Fedway, who are amazing. And they are, they're the big ugly version of a wholesaler, but they're working for us anyway. So.
Yeah. Any view on control states? So control states, for your background, is basically where the government is still in the wholesale business, so similar to how some of the Nordic markets here in Europe function. Any particular view on that, Guillermo?
Yeah, we're in Oregon, control state. If you're doing a brand, I suggest you hit them last. They're kind of government controlled, so there's government people working there, and their job is to make as minimum of work for themselves as they can, so they just want to have big brands in their portfolio. And really that's what they want to do, because the big brands will move by themselves with the advertising. They're not brand builders. So if you expect Oregon, for instance, to brand build for you, that's not going to happen. You got to put feet on the street there. And we signed up with them about 7 years ago, and we're doing okay there now. But we had to put feet on the street there, and we had to spend some time there. My biggest suggestion is, when you're looking at your market, look at your market potential and look at what the potential is for that. Study it well, and then study your distributors. Just don't go to the first guy that says yes. First guy or girl that says yes. Really study the distributors and figure out which is the right distributor for you. There's brand building distributors, and there's other types of distributors. So if you go to the right one, target them, figure out how to get to the guy that makes the decision. It's making a sale, and you have to figure out who makes that decision within that distributor, and you got to target to get in front of that guy. Otherwise, you're going to get married 3 or 4 times and waste a lot of time. And after you train some salespeople, and then you got to go and you change distributors, and you got to go train more salespeople. And if you're unfortunate enough to do it 3 times, you're going to run into a lot of cost problems, because that's very costly to train the salespeople. So just
Yeah. Very good. Could we go to the next chart for a second? From like how you just mentioned the distribution options, basically like the top supplier distributors, the second tier distributors, and clearing distributors. We talked about the top distributors. That's kind of like the ones that represent top suppliers. These are the ones that Guillermo, I think you mentioned earlier, that have basically these sales divisions for the larger suppliers. And then the second tier distributors might be some of the brand building ones, or the ones that basically have smaller suppliers, but they're subscale. And then clearing distributors are the ones that don't provide any sales force. So that's what Park Street does, for example, in New York, New Jersey, California, and Florida. So any view on, like what might make sense in what type of position? So Neil, do you want to comment on this first, the way how you thought about it at the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, we've done all 3 in different places. I think you start from the premise you're going to have to do most of the work yourself anyway. Each one of the 3 options has its downside. So with the big Diageo-aligned, Pernod-aligned distributor, getting airspace, salesman's time is a real challenge. It's as much as you can do to get the product delivered when you actually, one of your own people gets the order and gets the placement. Second tier, you've got the problem of reach. And if you did what we did in Massachusetts and we went with a wine distributor who was trying to get into spirits, you've got capability issues. So, to your point, Guillermo, training a sales guy who's used to selling Italian wine how to sell English new style gin is not the easiest thing in the world. And the last option, we tested New York with self-distribution through your own network. The fulfillment and everything was fine, but my guy ended up being more of a collection agent. Because whilst they're meant to pay on time and they can get into big trouble if they don't pay on time. And many of the places you wanted to go to, you had to open up the account. So it's inefficient in that perspective, albeit the selling price is higher. I think 4 years in now, I really, as we built some momentum in the states where we are, I'm really starting to see the benefit of the bigger distributors in terms of reach and muscle. But it's been an expensive road to get there. So we've had to create that momentum ourselves. And you don't get given that from day one. So there's always trade-offs, right? But in my experience, never assume that they're going to do anything for you. You have to plan on doing most of it yourself, at least for the first few years.
Yeah. Nick, you want to comment on it? Or Dan?
One of the phrases that we constantly use when we're talking about working with distributors is it's not about the value that they make, it's about the value that you add to the value that they make. And to your point, you have to do a hell of a lot of the work yourself. But when we're talking about the different levels, we do believe that working with the bottom tier of distributors that we're talking about, the ones that allow you to self-distribute, can be a huge advantage, if only for the first 6 to 18 months. Because what you're going to have to do there, they don't have a sales force, you are the sales force. And you might know how to sell your gin if you make it in England and sell it in England, and you might know how to sell your aquavit when you're selling it in Sweden. But selling your aquavit when you're in America or selling your gin when you're in America is a totally different ballgame. If you go out and have to do it yourself, yes, it's a lot more hard yards, it's a lot more time commitment. You're going to have to be in America. But you're going to start to learn the nuances that are going to be different about selling your products. And we believe that the value you get from learning those, how do I sell it slightly different to a bartender in North America, is hugely valuable and can really inform your strategy for subsequent years.
Nick?
So I'll just kind of echo what Neil and Dan said. I think it's really, when you see those three options, it's really about finding the right fit for your purpose. So we like to use that expression, what's the fit for purpose here? And I think you have to think again about, if you're a smaller supplier and you're entering the US market, are you going to get the attention from a large distributor? I think the odds are against you, and that's where a group like Harry's can come in. You can access the market in a much more cost-efficient way, but I want to reiterate the fact that it's still, all of these options are wholesaler options and brand scaling options. None of them are really brand building options. So none of these distributors are going to be really, when you're at an early stage in a small supplier, they're really not going to get the share of mind from them. Think about the large guys with tens of thousands of different SKUs. To get any share of mind from them is going to be very difficult. So I think you have to think about how you can get some share of mind from these smaller distributors, or alternatively, if you just want a perhaps temporary solution and partner who can help you access the market with you putting feet on the street and really brand building yourself, again, I think Park Street is a fantastic option. So again, just keep in mind, none of these are a panacea. I mean, there's a great deal of work required to build the brand, and most options are going to rely on you to ultimately do that. And then the larger the distributor, the better, in theory, the better they should be at scaling that up.
And Brandon, when you guys launched, you guys picked the route to go with the large 800-pound gorilla. Any feedback or any lessons learned from that experience?
Yeah, I mean, we made the decision to go with the large distributors. So we are the small brand in the big distributor. So, I mean, to everyone's point, that means we get zero attention. But on the plus side is that there is an account in the country that we can't reach. So, that we saw as a plus. we have made the decision to look at it as we view them as a delivery service, right? When I was at Bacardi, they were our partners. They helped us kind of set goals, and here's what we want to achieve. Here's our projections and hopes for next year. I don't have any of those conversations now. That doesn't happen. So I am going out, and our team is selling and doing all of that work. We just hope that they have product in inventory, and that when it is ordered by an account, that they'll deliver it for us. And if they do that and that works, I consider that a win. We have to be realistic. The amount of money they make off of Atlantico is nothing compared to Diageo, Pernod, Bacardi. So as long as you go into it with your eyes open and understand that, I think you're okay. Again, the plus side is you can get to any account because they call on everyone. Every on-premise or retailer orders from the major distributor. So if you're in their book, they can get your product. It's just it's incumbent on you to do the work.
How about the process of what Neil mentioned earlier, that sometimes these discussions involve like longer-term commitments or contracts that might prohibit you from, when you want to exit, to basically have like somebody else sitting on the table?
Yeah, that's one of the tricks of the big distributor is when they will agree to take on a small or a new brand, they certainly lock you into a pretty aggressive contract that favors them. So I'm in the middle of a 10-year contract, and it's a challenge in the sense, our standpoint, it was fine. We knew what we were getting into, but there's also been a lot of consolidation at the distributor level. We chose our distributor specifically because they didn't have Bacardi in their portfolio. We're a rum, Bacardi's the massive rum. We did not want to be in the Bacardi's distributor. Well, in the last year, Bacardi has now joined our distributor, and I'm locked into a contract. So the whole reason why I chose that distributor has kind of gone out the window, but I'm stuck. That's kind of business, and you've got to deal with it and roll with the punches. But, these are some of the challenges and
it would have been very difficult as a small player to negotiate an out clause for that thing, because it's more like a standard contract.
But it would have been fantastic. These contracts, there is no negotiating. It's absolutely a take it or leave it. I think they sent us the contract. We went back with 30 points of things that we wanted to discuss, of which one was even brought up. So. It is very much a take it or leave it scenario. It's heavily one-sided, I wish that weren't the case, but I don't know any small brand that has a contract with a large distributor that isn't in the same boat.
Yeah. Guillermo, any lessons learned from your approach, starting with a smaller distributor?
We use a survey form when we look at our distributors, so I really suggest that if you're developing your product, really think it out and really talk to a lot of salespeople. See what motivates them and see what would motivate them about your product to pick your distributor. But we've had the same issue. We were with a very large distributor, and although we could see their inventory, they had their sales rep, because there was a competitive product there to us, and that competitive product was always on incentive. And we're a killer of that competitive product. So the sales reps would actually tell the people at the accounts that they were out of stock. And it was a franchise state. And fortunately, we were not over the criteria for the franchise to kick in, and we were able to change. And we doubled our sales there immediately, going to another large distributor, but they were happy to have us. So I really suggest is really do your homework on the distributors. And Brandon says they won't modify their contracts. That's true. They really won't. So you really need to do your homework up front and target that distributor that fits your product the best, and will take care of you for the short term, at least for a 5-year window. Everything's at least a 5-year window in this industry. It's not a 1 year. There's nothing that happens in 1 year in this industry. We've been in it now 12 years, and we're still learning.
Yeah. Could we go to the next chart, please? So talking about getting, if you're in the distributor, to get like an above fair share of attention, because obviously if you start new, if you get the fair share of attention, which means zero, you got to somehow get attention, you got to somehow get noticed. So talking about margins, incentives, communicating, and dealing with people. So what's any kind of like lessons learned or tricks or tips, Dan?
So I think there's a big difference. Some of the distributors, thinking about guessing that most of you are from Europe, there's a big difference between. There are some big differences between European distributors and the US distributors. So some of the things you would do in Europe, typical things like having team trainings and making sure that you've trained all the staff and doing it on a regular basis. Of course, you need to do that. Brand toolkits, making sure they have access to digital assets, making sure they have access to kind of incentives and things like that. But there's a load of other pieces that are just very, very different, which I think I just wanted to start by saying. So, I mean, for starters, taking key members of your distributor team, sales directors, buyers, regional managers, some of the key account sales reps, bringing them to your operating unit, your distillery back here in Europe might sound like a huge extravagance, but if you want to start off really well, giving them some of that wow and spending quite a significant amount of money like that might be a really good idea. You've got to remember their portfolios, as I think Harry mentioned and several people have. They could have 5,000 to 10,000 different products in their portfolio. So it's up to you to make it very, very clear to them, how does this product differ? So if you've got a gin, how does it differ from the other 30 gins that are in their portfolio or the other 100 gins that are in their portfolio? You've got to have that absolutely down and make sure they understand that. Spending real time in market, that's another, we would recommend that if you are going to launch in North America and you are the founder, that you're probably going to need to spend about 20 weeks a year in North America minimum. It's not just ship it out there and see how it goes. And then the kind of bit which I think echoes some of the things we've already talked about, but choosing the accounts that you're in, they will know all of the accounts. And if you're in one of the big distributors like the guys were talking about earlier, they will know all of the accounts, they'll call on all of the accounts, but finding the accounts that you actually want to be in is down to you. They will sell it to people, they'll sell it to people who buy it. You want to sell it to great accounts. It's up to you to then actually find out which are the 30 accounts you want to be in that state when you launch. What you want, whether the next 30 you want in the following 6 months, and for you to decide what is the incentive that's going to drive those salespeople to actually sell stock in those accounts. So there's a hell of a lot more things that you need to do when you're in North America, and it is a lot more complex, and you're going to need to invest a lot more time and energy. Not to be depressing.
Thanks. Brandon, any kind of like things that worked very well for you?
Yeah, I mean,
in that big distributor,
we've tried all of these. When we talk about margins, right? When you're a big supplier, you have one margin within the distributor. When you're a small supplier, it's basically a 30% margin is sort of where you start, and you can kind of negotiate that if you know what you're doing, but generally speaking, it's around 30%. And so there isn't a whole lot you can do there, but in terms of incentives, you see all sorts of different things. It's giving, money on targets. You pay off reps for if they, deliver 2 bottles to an on-premise account, they make a certain amount of money. What we found is that for us, at least, those types of deals have not been beneficial. You lose control of where your product is going. So, you might see a huge bump in sales one month, but it's going into accounts that your product isn't going to turn in. And so we've kind of stopped doing that. For us, it's all about people. So it's all about the relationships, and more so with the sales reps who are on the street and not the higher ups within the distributor. If I can find one sales rep in Los Angeles who calls on 7 or 8 accounts that are key accounts of mine, I want to befriend that person and do what I can with that person, because that's a relationship that I can build and nurture over time. They call on another 80 accounts that are probably places I want to be. And so it's kind of going backwards. The general thought is, all right, if I can get sign off at the top, everything will trickle down. And for us, that hasn't worked. You know, we can get the sign off at the top, but it doesn't trickle down. So it's been much more beneficial for us to find key individuals who are in front of the buyers of accounts on a daily basis and try to get some of them on our side and behind our brand. And that's what's really worked and what's been most successful for us.
Got it. Guillermo, like, how about bringing people in to your facility or something from a distributor? Does that resonate?
That's been one of our key marketing programs, is bringing people down to our distillery. Over 1,000 bartenders have come down to our distillery. And probably about 50 of the sales reps have come down to our distillery. And because we have somewhat of it's a very small distillery, but it's a show property, and so we're very fortunate in that. But that strategy has worked immensely by, we pay the reps. If the reps want to come down, we pay their flight. We don't pay the money, but we pay their flight to spend some time. And that was very productive to get us going as a strategy. So I think you have to look at what's important to those reps, and will they spend the time. A lot of reps don't want to take trips anymore because they've got families, they've got kids. So that's not always a solution either. But we found it did work for us, and the one rep would come back and tell all the other reps that they went down, and the other reps got the story. But I think it's coming back. You have to have something. What is your value add? What is it that you're selling? And you really need to be able to tell that story clearly and concisely for the reps to be able to pick it up.
Very good. Could we go to the next chart, please? So the topic of like a supplemental sales infrastructure to go in, and I mean, we touched on a little bit before that you might not want to rely just on the distribution sales force, on the distributor sales force, but what's the right approach to think about, investing in your own or sharing it with others or getting a shared infrastructure? Brandon, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, it's, first of all, it's absolutely necessary, in my opinion. In terms of what format and how you do that, that's up for debate. I think when we launched, our objective was we're going to have our own sales force in each market. We might layer on top a brand ambassador in that market as well and go about it that way. And what we found is that one, that's very expensive, right? Having your own sales force is by far the most expensive approach. We've also used brokers, who are people who represent a handful of different brands in some markets. And like I said, we've also used brand ambassadors in some markets. And what my experience has been is it hasn't mattered what the model is. It's all about how good those individuals are. So I am no longer saying, oh, we have to have our own sales force, or, oh, we're only going to have brand ambassadors. I have, in one market, in Florida, I have my own salesperson. In New York, I have a broker. In California, I have a hybrid. In Colorado, I have just a brand ambassador. So it's not really, to me, what type of employee it is. It's really about how good is that individual at their job, and I am willing to work with them based off of what structure suits them best and works within our company.
Interesting. Guillermo?
Well, we use brand ambassadors. I think if you have a hand sell product, you have to use brand ambassadors. So if you want to be on the cocktail list, you got to use brand ambassadors. And they're expensive. And they can get out of control too, because they drink a lot. It's true. So you have that problem of managing people. But there really is no way around it. You have to have ambassadors or some people out there touching, because you cannot visit all the distributors and train all of these salespeople. And the salespeople, like it's been mentioned here, have 5,000 products. Why should they sell yours? So you have to have somebody out there working with them. For instance, I travel about 4 months of the year. I'm on the road now still, and I still do what we call general sales meetings with the distributors. I did one flew in from Europe all the way to Los Angeles to do a GSM with our distributor, their wine warehouse, in front of 250 salespeople, 20 minutes. That's all you get, 20 minutes. And you got to make an impression, and hopefully they remember it afterwards and they go back out and they sell more. So.
Very good. Can we go to the next chart, please? Want to accelerate a little bit so we have time for some questions. So anybody with regards to, where do you want to start first with regards to retail? Say you have the distribution figured out and you want to tell the distributor, where do you want to start? Like on versus off, independent versus chain? Is there like a particular?
I'll just throw out, we're 70% off on premise. So we're like an oddity out there. We're in the bars, in other words, and 30% on. So it's tough to get into the on premise. It's a big fight for the shelf space. In fact, they'll actually be out there. The competitors will pay to get your bottle off the shelf.
Brandon?
I think the general feeling in the U.S. is that you build brands in the on-premise and the off-premise is where you do volume. I'm not sure that's necessarily true anymore. I can name a lot of brands that have been built in the off-premise. So, I think generally that is the line that you're going to hear a lot of people say. Our approach just for our brand is primarily on-premise. So we are also about 70% in the on-premise. When we go into a market, our objective is really to hit up 30 to 50 key on-premise accounts, and then we try to get one off-premise retail chain and or place that you can buy online. And so, Chicago, there's a chain of 30 liquor stores. We want to be in that chain. I don't really care about other independents because most people know of this chain, and if they can't get there, I'll have an online option. And so that is our approach. It doesn't always work out that way, but that's how we try to do it. Try to get one chain off premise and then focus the rest of the time in the on premise.
Any experience from any one of you guys with regards to dealing with a large off-premise chain, the difficulties?
Yeah, I mean, they have expectations, right? So they will have, and they won't tell you what they are, but they'll have internal bars that, if your product doesn't sell X amount over the course of a few months, you're not going to be in that chain anymore. And so when you do that and you're making a commitment to go into that chain, there are things that you probably need to do as a brand to help that turn, right? So whether that's in-store tastings, running special programs with them. So you need to keep that turn going, otherwise you'll be off that shelf. One of the things that I think, at least was eye-opening for me going from the big company to the small company is how much of your marketing dollars you actually spend not on the consumer, right? It's money spent, doing incentives with the trade or within the retail accounts. So I think that's important to think about when you're trying to build a structure of when you're entering a market.
Okay.
And just one thing I was going to add around, which you mentioned sampling. In Europe, most people do build in the on-trade and move to the off. But when you go to North America, you still might build your brand in the on-trade, but there's actually really good volume to be had in the off-trade if you've got a budget for sampling. Sampling doesn't really happen a great deal in Europe, but if you go into a busy New York independent bottle shop on a Friday night, you'll find 3 or 4 sales reps there who will be sampling spirit products to people walking in. It's something totally alien to most Europeans, but a good sampling person could sell anywhere between 6 and, if they're amazing, 18 bottles on a Friday and a Saturday night. It means you're actually getting really quite significant volume through independent bottle shop if you've got investment in that place. And I think that does mean that the off-trade can be equally important in those early years if you're targeting particular off-trade accounts, independents.
I'll just add quickly, when we look at brands at Pernod, so Dan had mentioned it earlier about differentiation, and I think that's absolutely right. And Dan was talking about differentiating among a whole portfolio of gins that a distributor may have. I think it's important to look not just how you're differentiated among kind of your category, but also somebody earlier, I think Brandon might have mentioned, the top 5 or 6 markets that everybody's going after those markets. And I think the same logic applies here now too. If everybody is competing in the gin segment and everybody's going after these key markets and everybody's going for on-premise, getting placements on menus using brand ambassadors, I think you have to ask yourself if that's really a differentiated strategy and why somebody, yourselves or a potential partner, would have enough conviction to think that you can stand out from the rest of the crowd with the same type of strategy. So I'm not suggesting you develop strategies for accounts or distributors or geographies based on purely differentiating yourself from the crowd, but I think you have to think long and hard about why doing what everybody else does is going to help you succeed and why you're going to be able to do it different or better from everybody else. That's what I'd add.
Very good, thanks. Anybody with any questions? Maybe I'll take anybody? Well, I guess we answered it all. No, there we go. Here we go.
Hi, I work for Bacardi. I manage Leblon globally, Leblon Cachaça. And this movement that Bacardi did a year ago to go from small distributors to southern, how do you see this? Because Pernod and Diageo did this like few years ago, and this is new for Bacardi. So what is your opinion about working with small ones, in different ones in every single state, or having just one managing everything?
Maybe I take this first. So what Bacardi didn't work with really the small distributors. They just didn't work with a big national conglomerate. So they had 4 or 5 different partners. They had, one might have been in 10 states, one in 5 states, and so forth. And so they just did a national deal in order to possibly reduce their own sales force and put certain demands on the distributor. And you could argue one way or another if this is a great global strategy or not, but they believe that, look, there's a lot of efficiencies in there. We take costs out of people and put it in either, sales support or other activation measures. But they didn't really go from we have a small distributor that doesn't have the same reach to a different one, because on the particular market, in some distributors or in some states, actually, they went from the bigger to the smaller distributor. Well, it doesn't really sound right, because nationally they went to the biggest one and they're with the biggest one now. It's simpler route to market in general.
Yeah, but my question is for bigger brands, do you believe that it's the best movement, or how do you compare? What's your opinion based on the previous one comparing to the new one?
What I would think is that if you feel like you hit a ceiling and your partner in a particular market is not doing what they should do or what you expect them to do, and you had several discussions, and there's somebody else in that market that might promise you to possibly do better, then that's a possibility. So the problem that you always face is loyalty. If somebody got you from zero to something really big, and then you think about you want to now get much, much bigger, do you really want to kick this distributor out and go with the other guy? So there's a little bit of gentlemen's agreements also, and if you're down to 2 distributors in a particular market and you switch once, you might not have another option moving forward. So there's a lot of strategy around that too. So, if you feel like you have a distributor that is a really small one and there are 2 larger ones there, and you feel like, hey, we want to get to a larger chain, and the larger chain would not work with a smaller distributor, I think you can't do any other way other than going to a bigger distributor. So sometimes your hands are dealt to you. Anybody else? Any view on that? Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Maria Isabel, and I'm the founder of Canaco, which is the owner of a new cachaça brand which will be launched next year. For a starting brand, what would you say is the most effective way of actually approaching importers and distributors? Because we've talked a lot about ways of working with distributors, but the step prior, how would you recommend new brands to approach these distributors and importers? Thank you.
Do you guys want to?
First, to echo some of my colleagues mentioned earlier, I think you've really got to go and do once you've chosen which market you're actually looking at first, I think you really need to go and do a hell of a lot of homework in that market. One of the wonderful things about the kind of the startup revolution and craft revolution that's going on in the drinks market today is that you don't just have to go and ask bars and meet distributors. You can reach out to a lot of the actual craft spirit producers in each of those markets and go and find out who they actually rate. They'll be quite honest and share a lot more information with you than perhaps you could get wandering around this show, because they've all learned for themselves. So once you've decided which that market is, I think it's really about them going out and finding out who has great relationships with small businesses like yourselves.
Yeah, one thing that I've seen be successful is I've seen some brands go to key, and if it is a on-premise brand, go to key cocktail bars in a market. And if they talk to either the bartender or the bar manager of that account and find out, hey, where do you get some of your more, whether it's obscure or smaller brands that aren't coming from the big importers, they will say, hey, this company is really good. These guys have a great portfolio. You should talk to them and kind of work your way that way. I've seen that be successful quite a few times, actually.
With regards to the first next step, when you think about you have no idea about it, you can obviously always talk to us. But what I would say is you got to really think first about, before you go to a distributor, you got to think about a national wholesaler, a national importer. So where you get the federal compliance done, you got to get your label approved and all of that, and then you got to figure out where you go. So when we, for example, offer the direct to retail options, the clearing distribution, it's really for our clients that come in and might not be at the right time with the right distributor. So if, for example, somebody wants to launch in October, there's not one distributor in the whole United States that would take you or that would talk to you, because they would say, look, it's the fourth quarter, we're not going to talk to anybody because we're just focused on selling to retail, period. While if you come to us, because it's self-distribution, you can start at any given time. So you always have that option. But then once you have that national or that importing piece figured out, then you got to really go and figure out which market do you want to go and where you want to put your resources, your time, and your dollars to work. Anyhow, do we have the microphone still? Oh,
Harry, could I just add to that?
Yeah, sure, please.
My experience talking to the so-called full-service importers, and there are a number of usually former employees of wholesalers or brand companies who set up full-service importer operations. It's stating the blindingly obvious, but just remember what's in it for them. And I met a lot of people, and it was very clear that they were just looking at me as a source of revenue for the next 12 to 24 months, and they didn't really care about the longer term. So don't necessarily assume that the person who's giving you the right noises and the right words is actually fully aligned with you. That's one of the reasons why I have a heavy dose of cynicism about full-service importers, and why we prefer to work with Park Street and do a lot of it ourselves.
Oh, thanks. Okay, one more question I just heard. So,
yeah, some of the wholesalers are setting up these craft divisions. I don't know if any of you use them, and whether you think that they're a good thing or whether they are just a way for the wholesalers to effectively park the clutter as they see it and appease you whilst they focus on the brands that they care about.
I'm happy to take that. So my view on this is that there is an interest in making something work. I don't think it's just for lobbying purposes to say, hey, we have craft producers there, we don't want you guys to lobby against the three-tier system, so therefore we're keeping you there. But I think there's not really a lot of dollar commitment there, so they set up these divisions as subscale small distributors. So, and then they might load them up with a lot of different products. So to get a fair share of attention there is really complicated. So, and then they come back and say, hey, it's really up to you to do the work again. So then you just pay a very high margin for them to deliver the goods. But it really all depends on who it is and how far developed they are, because there are some, when you look at their portfolio, where you could say they could be really powerful. If they take you in, that could work.